Ronald, the rules lawyer. Today I'm going to go over the top 10 most shocking things I found looking at the original 1973 first draft of Dungeons and Dragons made by Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson several months before they published it. It is available in a public archive maintained by the US government. The draft is part of the record of Dave Arneson's lawsuit against Gary Gygax and TSR several years later, trying to sue over royalties for Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. I'm actually not sure why this draft hasn't been discussed much. I actually found discussions online in closed forums 6 or 7 years ago. Perhaps it was only recently that this case file was placed in the public record by the National Archives. I'm going to include a link to this archive document in the video description, which may expire, and so I'll keep that link updated to another place where the file's located. This early draft will also be included in Wizards of the Coast's book coming out this year on the making of D&D, along with a lot of other archival documents. But if you're looking for the 1973 draft, you can get it for free online. I will focus on the differences between this 1973 draft and what eventually became the final version in 1974. I actually did a video on the top 10 shocking things that modern players could find in original D&D. The focus of this video is on what might have been a lot of things that actually did not make it into the final version. First, to introduce myself, I am Ronald, the rules lawyer. I am a lawyer who has been running tabletop role-playing games since 2010. My preferred system is Pathfinder 2e, but I'm fascinated by the history of D&D and Pathfinder, which have the same roots. Also, support my Patreon if you haven't yet. It allows me to continue making videos for my channel. I don't make money as a lawyer. The video whose thumbnail is on the screen explains why. And if you support my Patreon, you get early access to many of my videos, ad-free, and access to exclusive content. Alright, so some background on this 1973 draft and why it's available to us today. It was submitted by Gary Gygax and TSR Hobbies as part of its defense when Dave Arneson, who was a co-author along with Gary Gygax of the original Dungeons & Dragons, sued Gary Gygax and TSR for royalties that he argued were due to him when Gary Gygax and TSR started publishing content for Advanced Dungeons & Dragons starting in 1977. They argued it was a different game, not covered under the original royalties contract between them. Arneson sued Gygax and TSR so that a court could settle the dispute. The contract had them sharing a royalty of 10% of the selling price of Dungeons & Dragons. All the parties reached a settlement before the case went to trial, with Dave Arneson agreeing to a royalty of 2.5% on sales. But leading up to that settlement were 2 years of litigation between 1979 and 1981, in which the parties went through what is called discovery in a civil case, where each side presents evidence to the other and questions the other side's witnesses in sworn depositions, for a variety of reasons, including preparation for a possible trial, trying to get the judge to rule for you in lieu of a trial, and also to try to leverage your side in settlement negotiations. However, even though I'm a lawyer, I will not talk about the case itself, not in this video. I plan to do at least one more video on that, and I invite people to leave comments and to say what questions you have about the case, what you're interested in, that will help me prepare for that video. The documents in this case are now part of the National Archive, at least all the unsealed ones, apparently, and one of those documents is the 1973 draft of D&D. It was a defendant's exhibit, so submitted by Gary Gygax and TSR. I guess they were arguing that Dave Arneson had a limited role in drafting D&D, and his contributions did not carry over to the AD&D game. I don't know. I actually have to do more research into the case to find that out. Before going into the top 10 shocking things, I'm going to say some general things about the manuscript, which is utterly fascinating. There's a typewritten manuscript, but there's also this handwritten table of contents. And as you can see, the original plan, or at least the first draft, was a single volume. It was not divided into 3 volumes. And it is even harder to find your way around the book this way than in the final version, which itself has been criticized for being hard to navigate. There isn't even a single place to find info on the different character classes. Their information spread out throughout the book. We also see this charming, what looks like the beginnings of a handwritten draft by Dave Arneson, in which he writes next to introduction, "This is where Gary editorializes and tells neat stories as much as his little heart desires, and if he wants to use the extra pages. A rulebook is a rulebook, not a novel." Dave apparently was cautioning his friend to not wax eloquent, as I'm sure he knew Gary was wont to do. Now we get to the typewritten manuscript, I believe prepared by Gary Gygax. There are handwritten notes here and there, including, I believe, Dave Arneson here, changing the title of the book itself to what it eventually became. The foreword by Gary Gygax is dated July 1st, 1973, and so this manuscript was probably produced around that time. He also describes himself as Guide on Games and Miniatures Rules Editor. They were proposing D&D to accompany Guide on Games, which Gary Gygax had published his famous chainmail war rules under, proposing that Guide on Games publish it. However, Guide on Games did not have faith in the project and rejected it, and that's what led to Gary Gygax and his friend Don Kay collecting capital to form their own company, Tactical Studies Rules. It's also a product of its time and shows the reality of publishing things on a typewriter. First of all, this is an awful photocopy that's in the court record. You can hardly read it. But because they did not have modern word processing, you had to decide if you wanted to insert material between two pages that you had already typed, you had to add a letter to the end of the number so that it was clear it went in between. And this is actually page 39J. It's hard to read because so many page 39s were typed out. This also implies that they were still working on the organization of the document while still writing it out, and the lack of organization in the sections also suggests that. All right, so on to the list finally. I'll go from least shocking to most. Number 10 is that they told players to metagame. I'm going to read this passage from the introduction. It says, "If you are a player purchasing the Dungeons & Dragons rules, in order to improve your situation in an existing campaign, you will find having a copy handy a great advantage." It then says, "A quick check on how many hits are required to slay a typical 6-headed Hydra, for example, may save your game life." This is just really fascinating to me. It shows a completely different mindset from what we typically expect in modern tabletop role-playing, where you are trying to immerse yourself in the fantasy and your characters don't necessarily know everything about what they're facing. This shows an early attitude that they are playing a game, and if you know the rules of the game that you're playing, then you should do better at it. It also notes that the person running your campaign, they don't even have a term for that yet, should make changes to the basic rules and write them in pencil in the books themselves, which to collectors today sounds like sacrilege, by the way, but also for the purpose of players knowing what changes that referee is making to the rules. This will not be included in the final version of D&D. They decide by then that they're fully invested in the players not knowing everything and the D&D surprising players. Gary Gygax will famously have the opposite view in just the span of a few years when he writes in the Dungeon Master's Guide, "A player who has the Dungeon Master's Guide must be viewed as, quote, something less than worthy of an honorable death." Number 9, this first draft assumed player versus player conflict. Here are some passages. It says, "There is the natural rivalry among players themselves. When they attain the top rank of their various classes, they must choose domains in which to build their castles and live. This will result in warfare between players, and usually such battles will provide the most exciting tabletop play." They also describe baronies. After players build their own strongholds and control a territory and population, they will have opportunity to attack each other, improve their lands, and or expand. And this is very fascinating because those who know the history of D&D know that D&D was started as a war game. And this is the political map of the original D&D campaign, Blackmoor, run by Dave Arneson, in which the players controlled different parts of the map. He used the chainmail combat rules that Gary Gygax had made and were designed for mass combat. This idea that players came to a D&D game to be in conflict with each other is also shared by the immediate predecessor of D&D, the Braunstein campaigns that Dave Arneson directly participated in that were run by David Wesley. Braunstein was a fictional town in which each player played a single character and they all had competing goals. It was mediated by a referee, David Wesley, and the players could do anything they could think of. They would often have secret conversations with David Wesley. For more on this early history of how D&D was born out of wargaming, I highly recommend the excellent documentary Secrets of Blackmoor, in which the makers interviewed people in the original Blackmoor campaign and who were part of the gaming circles that Dave Arneson was in the Twin Cities of Minnesota. And it's fascinating to me that the way this is written, the players fighting each other in mass combat is seen as the most exciting type of play. I think by the time the final rules come out, while they still have rules for establishing a barony, building stronghold, and having warfare, by then I think they catch on to the fact that it's the underground dungeon delving that is truly the most compelling part of Dungeons & Dragons. This language explicitly saying players are to be at war with each other is removed, as far as I know, in the final version. Just to give you an idea of what Gygax and Arneson imagined players doing, here's what they called the Angry Villagers rule. Whenever the referee feels that players have committed some unforgivable outrage, he need merely invoke the Angry Villager rule. So I assume players were perhaps committing injustices in order to get one over their fellow players, perhaps conscripting every single person into an army. A version of this rule actually makes it into the final version, but I think the mechanism of the Angry Villagers is funnier here. It says, these enraged citizens will move faster than any player, fight better, and have overwhelming numbers until such time as the player or players in question conform to the desired action. So it's literally telling the referee not to talk to your player, but just to hit them over the head with something in the world to keep them in check. Number 8 is that magic users did not need spell books. Modern players all expect that magic users, now called wizards, have a limited selection of spells that are kept in their jealously guarded spellbook. However, there's just no such thing in the 1973 draft. It just lists all the spells that magic users get and clerics get. There's no talk anywhere about spellbooks. I don't think the creators have figured out yet how powerful spellcasting can be, and they have not decided yet to rein in the power of magic users by limiting them to spellbooks. Now, this is lower on this list because in the final version, there's no language saying magic users are limited to only spells they can find or have in a spellbook. But at least in the final version, there's this language that they must have a book of spells that they cannot lose. In our first draft, it looks like magic users can access their spells at all times, even if they are, say, captured and put in a cell without their gear. Number 7 is that elves did not multi-class. Now, people who know original D&D know that elves had this weird rule in which they can wake up in the morning and decide whether they're going to be a fighting man or a magic user that day. They also later in basic Dungeons & Dragons have the abilities of both classes. But in the 1973 version of D&D, elves were limited to one class and could then take levels in the other class later. It says that elves as magic users may progress no further than the warlock level. That's the level title for level 8. In the fighting men class, elves may not progress beyond hero, level 4. And it says, after progressing to the maximum level in one class, elves may begin to accumulate experience points in the other class. This is similar to what will be called dual classing for humans in Advanced Dungeons & Dragons. And then this is followed by language that seems to contradict what we just read. And this is not the only instance where the 1973 rules are hard to follow because it seems to contradict itself. Either elves are the only race that can change class, or everyone can change class, but elves have more freedom to do so. It's not 100% clear to me, because it suggests that a cleric can also advance as a fighter. This one just left me confused, so I'm going to move on. Number 6, non-real players and other terminology changes. They have not come up with the term characters to denote your fictional avatar in the game yet. Here we see the section about player options being called the players, and we see NPCs described as non-real players. The creatures you encounter are not real because they're not played by a real person at the table. There's, I think, stuff we can unpack here. We don't have the idea that you're immersing yourself in a world as a character in that world yet. Everyone is playing a game, a diversion, something to win. We also see in a couple places in the manuscript where it's apparent that they have not yet come up with the word classes yet to describe what we call classes today. Here's the start of the section describing the classes, and it says statistics regarding types/classes. They even write magic users/classes with the list of the level titles underneath that, which kind of leaves me confused. Does classes refer to each level title? Anyway, they're probably going to talk about it, Dave and Gary, to figure this out. Another terminology change is that not only did the 1973 version have anti-clerics and clerics, they also had anti-fighters. They had anti-swordsmen, anti-swashbucklers, and anti-warriors, which I just thought was funny because they're warriors too, they're swashbucklers too, I guess just because they are against warriors played by real players. Number 5 is that magic users could raise the dead. Here is the spells chart that I showed earlier. It said that magic users can raise dead if above 11th level. Note that there is no 6th level of spells yet. It's actually under the description for animate dead. It says, if the magic user is above the 11th level, he may attempt to actually revive the dead body. This does have the disadvantage of having a 50-50 chance of utterly destroying the body. It is atomized and never seen again, a problem that clerics don't have to deal with. But it's interesting that they went with the idea that why not? Magic users should be able to raise the dead. Magic using is powerful. They haven't decided yet to make that the exclusive domain of clerics. Number 4 is that monsters were weaker in 1973 D&D. Here is the attack matrix in the final version of D&D. You can see that a monster with up to 1 hit die, needing a 17 to hit armor class 2, is someone with plate armor and a shield in the system. This continues in advanced Dungeons & Dragons. The monster still needs a 17 to hit armor class 2. However, in 1973, that monster needed to roll a 19. They had a significantly lower chance of hitting party members. We also see that if the player character has leather armor instead, which is usually an armor class that is 4 weaker, then the monster needs to roll a 17. This actually seems to conflict with another table elsewhere in the book, but the bottom line is that monsters had a significantly harder time hitting player characters. And along these same lines, we go to number 3, which is that the XP requirements were lower in 1973 D&D, particularly advancing from level 1 to level 2, that crucial period at the beginning of an adventurer's career when you are your most vulnerable. Here is the chart from OD&D, the final version. You see that a fighting man needs 2,000 XP, a magic user needs 2,500, and clerics need 1,500. In 1973, this is what it was. The fighting man needs only 1,000. The magic user needs what looks to be 2,000, and the cleric only needs 500. These last 2 changes are a big deal together. At level 1 in Dungeons & Dragons, you can die from a single blow. And in 1973, it was a little easier to survive that first level. What's shocking here to me is actually the fact that they changed it to make it even harder to survive that first level of experience. It was already deadly enough, and it's interesting to me that they decided to prolong that agony. The second most shocking thing was that armor class improved with level. In every subsequent edition of D&D except 4th edition, there's kind of a phenomenon where your armor class levels off. It doesn't progress with you. For some reason, attack bonuses still improve. Not in 1973 D&D. Here's some language from the draft. It says that all men, fighters, magic users, and clerics will add +1 to their armor class when they attain the level of or equal to 4th level. Fighters get another +1 at 8th level, and then again at 12th and 16th levels. Magic users and 10th level clerics get an additional +1 at higher than 8th level. And I'm not sure why this was abandoned in the final version. There's something logical about fighters being better at avoiding blows, just as they become better at landing blows as they become more experienced. And I assume in medieval combat that sword fighting was an important way to defend yourself, to parry blows. Anyway, we have this strange legacy in D&D, including in 5th edition, where your armor class doesn't go up, despite your combat skill increasing, which I cover in a recent video. All right, the number 1 most shocking thing, and some of you may know this already who've know the history of D&D, is that ability scores were different. We don't have our classic 6 of strength, dexterity, constitution, intelligence, wisdom, and charisma yet. What we have instead are intelligence, cunning, strength, health, and appearance. Intelligence was the prime requisite for magic users and strength for fighting men. And cunning is the prime requisite of clerics, which I find fascinating. There actually is no place in the manuscript that describes what clerics are and why they get their powers. One can imply that they have a connection to the gods just from real-world knowledge of what the clerics are and from the level titles. And their prime ability score is cunning. And I just think that's fascinating, that the idea of harnessing the power of a god requires cleverness, cunning, is a very intriguing one, let's say. And also we don't have dexterity, which is interesting to me. One would think they would come up with that by this point. There's a lot of things that can happen in a dangerous dungeon delve that one could argue requires quickness, agility, balance. But then again, the only groups that were playing this game at the time were Dave Arneson and Gary Gygax and the players they were running the game for. In the final version, they will introduce dexterity, and it has an effect on the accuracy of ranged attacks. And it doesn't affect anything else, not even your armor class. That changes in Greyhawk, the first supplement to OD&D, which came out in 1975. Also, we see that the name Constitution hasn't come up yet. It's called Health. And high health gave you significantly more hit points here. They say average scores are 9 to 12. And so when you have a health of +1 or +2, I assume that means higher than that. So 13 or 14. If you have that, you get +1 hit point per hit die. And additionally, you have at least 3 hit points per level. Also, getting +1 per hit die is much easier to get than the minimum of 15, which is the requirement in the final version. If your health is 15 or higher, you get 2 bonus hit points per hit die, and you cannot get less than 4 hit points with a new level. Although this went both ways, let's face it, those who have higher health are the ones who will tend to survive. So among those strong characters, you could get significantly more health in this 1973 version of D&D. Also, we see that appearance, what later will be called charisma, and also incorporate personality, not just how you look, is very unimportant according to the text. It says, it is seldom used and it can be ignored. Its example is for niche situations like when a male player is captured by a witch. Will she turn him into a swine or keep him as a lover? And as in my video on OD&D shows, charisma becomes a god stat. It allows you to have a retinue of non-player characters that can multiply your power greatly. Those of you who follow my channel and have followed my top 10 list will be shocked that I only have 10 in this video. I actually thought I would do only one more video on the documents from this court case, but I found a lot of things I wanted to include in a video that I did not include here. I wanted to keep this video to a manageable size. There are many fascinating smaller changes and also some more subtle things like language here and there that suggested to me that there was a change in what the designers were thinking between this first draft and the final version. If there's enough interest, I can make that video. So that's pretty much it for now, and for my video on the court case, definitely leave comments on questions you have about that and what you'd like me to cover. Meanwhile, here's my outro. Make sure to like the video and also subscribe to my channel. Support my Patreon if you haven't yet. It allows me to continue making videos. You get ad-free early access to many of my videos and exclusive content. And also join my Discord. I participate there a lot. We talk Pathfinder 2e, other tabletop role-playing games, and the history of the hobby, and about gaming in general. So that's it. I have been Ronald the Rules Lawyer. I'll see you next time.